Hey everybody, Ben here from Cinder Studios, and today I'm talking about painting mountains with a knife and with a brush, and why I actually really prefer painting them with a brush. Stick around. So a lot of painters, like myself, when we first started out, we were really inspired by the painter Bob Ross. He used to paint on PBS, and now his stuff's all over YouTube and Twitch. But one thing he always did with his mountains was use a knife, specifically to get the highlights and the shadows. What's interesting about painting with a knife, and I found this over the course of the past, I guess you could say maybe 10, 11 years, and that's that knife mountains kind of all look about the same. They're not necessarily bad looking, but from a distance they look really nice. But as soon as you start kind of get a little bit closer on a painting, you're like, oh, you used a knife for those mountains, didn't you? Because it's just a certain look. It always kind of creates a certain look to the mountains, and I think that as an artist, if you're still relying on using a knife for your mountains and you've been painting for a long time, you might want to look away and try and start using a brush, because I think your mountains, if you start using a brush, will look a little bit more complex. And you're like, all right, Ben, that sounds interesting, and you may or may not agree with it. So let's take a look at what's here in front of me. Okay, so for today's demo, I've got a piece of prepared canvas stapled down to a piece of wood to sort of simulate sort of a hard canvas board. The canvas itself, I primed a little bit with, did a sky with a thin wash of, it looks like probably cerulean blue, although it might be phthalo, I'm not sure, I did it a while ago. In the foreground you see sort of this lumpy rock section here. Don't worry about that right now, we're going to take care of that later. Over on the palette, I've got my sort of mixed paint gray. I make it out of just throwing leftover paint into a jar, so it's really a non-specific color, but it's sort of a nice base to start with. I have a little cerulean blue, some titanium white, and I'm going to be making a dark out of some Mars black and some red oxide here. And that's sort of what we're going to be using here to start. I've got a knife in one hand. It's a nice, one of those sort of traditional, kind of like chisel tip knife designs. You can use more of a painting knife design, but I think specifically for the mountain technique, it's better to use one of the ones that has more of that angular edge. I also have a couple of flat brushes, as well as a really small, thin, bright down at the bottom that I'm going to be using to scrub some color in a little bit later. Now, when it comes to, painting that classic Bob Ross kind of mountain, you kind of build up that paint on the edge of your knife. He's usually mixing a color, like a dark or something like that. I'm actually going to start with a mid-tone. That's usually how I work. Kind of get that scraped edge, a little bead of paint on the edge of the knife. Actually, I'm going to get a little bit more. And you just, come in and just drop in the shape of the mountain. And of course, I'm using acrylics today. He used oils traditionally. And what you'll note is that because acrylics dry very quickly, I'm going to be dipping sort of a little bit into water to thin some paint out here and there. So occasionally I will use a knife to maybe make a mountain peak or something, but I don't use it, I don't just use the knife. I'm kind of use maybe the knife to get that edge and then push some paint down around with it. And then really kind of come back in with a brush later. But I just want to drop in those couple of shapes. And he would probably have a little paint thinner on his brush, but I'm just, or even none because he used oils. And then he'd take the brush and pull out the shape of the mountain. About like so. And that doesn't look, terrible. Actually starts out looking pretty good. Let me go ahead and mix my dark here. Kind of want just this to resemble a little bit of like a deep brown. Oh, move the damn thing. Alright. Maybe add just a little blue to that. It's going to be in the shadow. then you have sort of your shadow color. I'm kind of imagining lights kind of front and center here, so. And as he always would say, drop. And we're just kind of hovering with the knife, my hand, letting my hand kind of shake a little. My hand's really good at that, more so than most people. I'm just building in the sections where that's going to come down. And he would just leave that real thick. And then you come in with a white for like a snowy mountaintop and add just a hint of blue to it. Because snow isn't usually pure white, it kind of reflects light a little bit like that. So spread it around. Get the, pull some of that off. Kind of get that scrape and get that angle, that downward angular thing to get the little bead of paint. Have to forgive me, my hands are really shaking this morning. Just kind of drag it along. I also haven't done this in a long time because I use a brush. This is a little too thick here. That's all right. We'll just make it work. Probably should have done the highlights first, but again, it's been a very long time since I've done knife mountains, so. Yeah, right about like that. Simple little knife mountain. I probably could have done a little better here, but not the worst thing ever. I can even come in and just kind of pull some of that down at the base. Just to kind of even things out a little. Especially since I'm going to be going now into using a brush for a mountain. So yeah, it kind of creates a little snowy mountaintop, and it works. It's an easy technique. Really, anyone can do it. I haven't used it, again, in my painting techniques in at least 5 or 8 years or something like that. It's been a long time since I've even attempted something like that. It does take a little bit of practice. But now I'm just going to go straight into using a brush, and this is what I really prefer to do. I'm going to thin the paint just a little. Make sure I have a nice flow. At this point, my canvas is still really rough, so I just want to come in. And I'll do a similar thing, maybe like a 1-2 peak mountain here. I'm just leaving this all wet. I don't even really care at this point. And because it's me, because I like different sort of almost sci-fi mountain shapes, I'm going to maybe do a secondary peak that kind of comes up like this. You know, like I mentioned before, one, because my canvas is rough, and also because I'm not using the base with the knife, it can be hard to get that nice peak. I'm just going to thin the paint a little to get it. Also, this is just the base color, so no need to be that precise. Again, foreground mountainy thing. We're going to worry about that later, not a problem. I use this same color in this, so I'm just going to go ahead and kind of paint right on top of it a little. And again, I mean, I'm more used to painting with the brush this way, so you're going to see a little bit of an improvement here. Actually, probably a lot of bit of improvement. And I don't want you to count that against this technique, because the knife technique is a good technique. But today's demo is really just to show that it's not the only one. I'm adding a little white to the base of this to get some idea of some mist in here. Like lightens at the bottom. Okay. Also, like you have something in the background like this, it's kind of okay to use a knife because it's going to be less detailed anyway. It's further in the back. Personally, I would have let this dry completely and then sprayed over it with some white spray paint to give the little more of an illusion of a mist. You can also just glaze over it once it's dry, but one thing at a time. So I went dark first, light second. Again, I probably should have gone light and then dark. Apologies for that. But since that's kind of the way I did that, I'm going to go ahead and do that again on this one. So my light is in the center, so my shadows here are going to be on the right. And with a brush, you can really make a lot more conscious decisions of where those little nooks and crannies are. You can do it with a knife, but the knife kind of takes control, and it gives you just a lot of paint all at once. Or even if you're not using a lot of paint all at once, it's a large shape. So when you can kind of push and even use just like the very tips of the bristles, you have the control to get a lot more variance in your shapes. And because we're not painting super thick, you can paint over it a lot easier. You can if you make a mistake, you don't like if I made a mistake here, and to be fair, again, I've made a few mistakes here. If I would have kept scraping, and I really wanted to, I was like, I want to go back and fix this. Very, very quickly, that muddies up and just becomes a mess. So you have a lot more freedom, a lot more ability to make mistakes and learn from your mistakes and keep painting on top of them when you're using a brush. So that shadow comes here. Kind of keeping it pretty similar. I want to have that distinct edge. Maybe coming most, if not all the way down. Out like that. Now, instead of a real snowy white layer, I'm actually going to mix a little bit more complex of a color. Still sticking with sort of that light blue, but I'm going to leave all this residual darker stuff on the edge of my brush here, making more of a gray. And then I'll do a second highlight with the white. So now, got that on the edge of my hand because I'm an idiot. Now I can come in and push those highlights. And letting, kind of the way you'd let with painting a knife mountain, you let the knife do the work, same thing, you're letting the brush kind of do the work. And I'm just grazing on top with it, using that shape, that hard edge on the top of the brush to get my edges, and then just dragging with the back of the brush. So I still get that little bit of a drag effect, that nuance that you kind of get at the base down in here. But it's not as forceful. And again, with the knife, you have to make decisions, make them quickly. You have a lot more of a relaxed painting experience with a brush. And because, again, we're not painting thick, these underlying colors, specifically the gray and now about half of that dark, are already starting to dry. And so I don't have to worry about scraping through something and making a muddy mess. I can really just ease through it. Getting a little darker here than I'd like. I'll push a little more white into that. Yeah, a little hint of water. As Ross himself put it, thin paint sticks to thick paint, and it's totally true, so. Got a lot of paint on the back of the brush there. I need to wipe some of that off. So now when you kind of do that little bit of a bouncing around with the brush, it's a lot more effective. It has a lot more of an impact with the piece. And because you can take your time and build up the darker colors versus the lighter colors in your midtones and everything else, you have the ability to really kind of push that color around. I'm going to get some of my dark and some of this blue to get a good transition in here now. I come back in and double back with the paint. Get those nice drop-offs. Push that contrast a little bit more. And you don't lose the contrast with it, but you know, it maybe takes a little more effort, but again, I think it's a lot more fun this way because you can make much more interesting decisions about the shapes of your rocks going all the way through. Again, like I said before, that was sort of a first highlight. Now I'll come back in with closer to pure white. Grab maybe just a hint of that blue because we're reflecting some of the sky color. And now, like at this point, the stuff I started with, it's a little tacky. It's not completely dry. I get just a tiniest bit of water to thin that with. Maintain the thin to thick ratio and be a little more sparing with that white. Ideally, I'd probably wait another 10 minutes for the rest of this to dry before I did another layer, but sticking with sort of a wet into wet concept. There it is. Just actually a little bit more paint at this point. So I do have to work on top of it being a little wet. Like so. I could probably keep going, and I kind of want to, but I really should stop at this point because we have a third rock to get to, which is this one in the foreground that I had kind of mentioned in the beginning about how we were going to get back to it. Well, now we're back to it. So one thing that I did for quite a few years and have gotten away from a little bit because it can very quickly overpower your piece is use some of Golden's light molding paste to build up a thicker texture before you're ready to paint your rock. I usually do this if I'm using it today to do just one or two big foreground rocks to add a little bit of actual texture to the piece. Again, note here I said actual texture. So while this you get some thick paint texture, this you can really play a lot with and kind of keep working to make it more and more realistic. The light molding paste is kind of almost a hybrid of the techniques. You're getting the nice thick texture of the acrylic, but at the same time you're not totally destroying any little bits of nuance that you might get with a regular brush technique. So what I did to create this is I took the knife actually first, mixed up a nice thick batch of the gray and some paste, and I applied it to get those sort of peaks at the top, and then using a brush while everything was still wet, I kind of came in and what I have now come to affectionately call paint sculpting, kind of build in specific lines and textures within the rock itself. And now after that I let it dry, and you have to, because if you try and work with that stuff when it's wet, and it does take quite a bit of time to dry, even being acrylic, just because it's a very thick medium, what you're going to do is just rip all that texture right off the canvas, and that's not really ideal unless maybe you want to rip all the texture off your canvas, but there's no point in doing that if you did all the work. So in using the light molding paste as a base, I'm going to go into my dark and thin it out. Because I have all that texture already on there, I actually don't need a ton of texture with the paint itself. So I actually like this technique because it's in the long run actually saves paint, because I just need some of this, and then my regular colors, I don't need quite as much to get the technique to work right. And what we're going to be doing is using a thin paint, but we're also going to be dry brushing with it. So I'm just kind of dragging that little bit of a dark color over top of some of these areas. Whatever color you kind of used as your base color for these rocks is going to show through a little bit. So actually a lot of times I will use a dark with this mix first, and then just do highlights and highlights and highlights on top of that, and then sort of a final shadow layer with like a deep blue or a black. I'm actually not going to use a ton of shadow in this. Just going to pull it a little bit. Mostly so you can see the texture, because that'll become even more pronounced when we start getting our highlight. I'm going to use my grayish white highlight first. Again, similar to the brush rocks here. And just drag that along. Picking up all these interesting textures that I built up ahead of time. That way it takes a lot of the guesswork out, and you can still kind of play with that texture and get all those weird, unique variants. Alright, one more big white highlight. I'm just going to go into the pure white here. Make sure you guys can really see that as I'm dragging that along. Why not a little blue? I just don't want it to be that gray color. And now, very little paint, just dragging mostly with the flat back end of the brush and not really touching the tips of the brush to the canvas a ton. I'm just kind of dragging with it, picking up on all those little bumps that are sticking up off the up off the canvas. Kind of ran out of texture here. Just got to come in with the brush. And that's really all there is to it. Super easy techniques, super simple, but generally I feel way better and way more accurate to even a point of realism than using a knife for a mountain. Again, I'm not totally dissing Bob Ross's technique. I can still watch those videos and be like, that looks awesome. But at the end of the day, when I'm painting and when I'm seeing new painters start out on stuff, it's like, okay, using a knife, but that should be a stepping stone to using a brush. It shouldn't replace it, and you should never treat knife painting and painting rocks with a knife as the only way to do it, especially when using a brush can be that much more effective. Okay, so now you guys saw that up close. Let's see how these look from far away. Honestly, I think the examples speak for themselves. Yeah, the rock mountain, it's interesting from the distance, but when you're looking for something a little more detailed, a little more interesting, and a lot more complex for your piece, I definitely recommend picking up a brush and just painting a mountain by hand rather than trying to lazily jog through it by using a knife. So that's my comparison of why I prefer to use a brush rather than a knife when painting mountains. But what do you guys use? If you're in one camp or the other, has this tutorial kind of changed how you think about how to paint mountains? Or if you've never painted a mountain before, which one are you going to choose now that you've seen the difference? As always, if you found this interesting or learned something, go ahead and hit that like button. Consider supporting on Patreon, follow on Instagram, Facebook, and DeviantArt. And this has been from Cinderblock Studios. Subscribe for more, and I will see you guys next time.